The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the breeze as the sun cast long, golden streaks across the vast wilderness. The river, swollen from recent rains, churned angrily through the valley, its icy waters rushing with untamed fury. For seasoned wildlife photographer Daniel Carter, this was just another day in nature, another opportunity to capture the untold stories of the wild. But as he adjusted his lens, something unusual caught his eye. A massive shadow bobbed along the surface of the river, tossed and turned by the unrelenting current. At first, he assumed it was driftwood, perhaps a fallen tree, but then a desperate movement. A paw, a snout, a pair of wide, terrified eyes. A bear. Daniel's breath hitched. The animal was struggling, its powerful limbs thrashing against the pull of the river. Bears were strong swimmers, but this one, either injured or exhausted, was quickly losing the fight. A primal instinct kicked in, overriding reason. Without thinking, Daniel sprinted toward the bank, scanning for anything that could be done. He wasn't alone. Two other men, campers from a nearby site, had also spotted the struggling creature. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them. They had to act. Little did they know, what happened next would defy all logic, leaving them questioning everything they thought they knew about the wild. The bear lay motionless on the riverbank, its massive chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths. The rescue had been reckless. Daniel and the two men had barely managed to drag the beast from the water, risking their own lives in the process. Now, soaked and shivering, they stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. It was a young male, judging by its size, not yet in its prime, but large enough to be dangerous if it decided to lash out. Yet, as Daniel crouched beside it, he saw something in the bear's dark, glassy eyes that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was trust. The bear, despite its obvious exhaustion, made no attempt to flee or defend itself. Instead, it remained still, blinking up at its rescuers as if it somehow understood that they had saved its life. Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse still hammering from the adrenaline rush. This wasn't normal. Wild animals, especially predators, did not show gratitude, not like this. One of the men, a burly hiker named Rick, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't like this," he muttered, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. "Bears don't act this way. He should be running, or at least trying to get back on his feet." Daniel agreed. Something was off. But before he could voice his thoughts, a rustling in the nearby brush made them all freeze. A second bear emerged from the trees. This one was larger, an older female, her fur thick and matted from the wilderness. Unlike the young male, she didn't hesitate. She moved with purpose, her powerful limbs carrying her forward in slow, deliberate steps. Daniel braced himself, half expecting an attack. He had heard of mother bears being fiercely protective, even of offspring that weren't their own. But what happened next defied all logic. Instead of showing aggression, the female bear made a low, throaty sound, a deep, resonant hum that sent vibrations through the ground. The young male's ears twitched, and to Daniel's astonishment, the bear responded with a similar sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a warning. It was something else. It was communication. The female approached cautiously, her massive head lowering toward the younger bear. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size, she nudged him, first at the shoulder, then along his side, as if checking for injuries. The young bear, still too weak to stand, gave a low whimper. Rick let out a nervous chuckle. "You ever seen anything like this?" Daniel shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away. Bears were social to a degree, but this was something different. It was tender, deliberate, almost human. And then, the most incredible thing happened. The female bear turned her massive head toward them. She looked at each of them in turn. Daniel, Rick, and the other man. Her deep-set eyes seeming to hold something more than just instinct. Recognition, understanding. And then, ever so slightly, she nodded. It was a slow, deliberate motion, so subtle that Daniel almost thought he had imagined it. But he hadn't. The others had seen it too. The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken, something neither science nor reason could fully explain. And then, without another sound, the female bear nudged the younger one once more before stepping back into the woods, vanishing into the shadows as swiftly as she had appeared. Daniel exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. "What the hell just happened?" Rick whispered. Daniel had no answer. But one thing was certain. What they had just witnessed wasn't ordinary animal behavior. It was something else, something deeper, something that would change the way they saw the wild forever. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse still racing from the sheer intensity of what he had just witnessed. The moment replayed in his mind, the slow, deliberate nod of the female bear, the almost human-like tenderness in her actions. It defied everything he thought he knew. A breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispers in the dark. The scent of damp earth and pine filled the air, grounding him, but his thoughts remained untethered, spiraling into 100 different directions. He had spent years studying wildlife, dedicating his life to understanding the untamed world, yet he had never encountered anything like this. Rick let out a shaky breath beside him. "Tell me I didn't just see that." Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his damp hair. "You saw it." His voice was barely more than a whisper. "We all did." The third man, Jason, still stood frozen, his eyes locked on the spot where the bear had disappeared. "I've spent my whole life in the woods," he murmured. "Bears don't do that. They don't acknowledge people like that." Daniel felt the weight of those words. Acknowledgement. That was exactly what it had been. Not mere curiosity, not simple recognition of a presence, but something deeper, an understanding. He turned his gaze back to the young bear, still sprawled on the riverbank, its breath slow but steady. It hadn't moved much, as if absorbing what had just happened alongside them. The animal wasn't panicked, wasn't trying to escape. Instead, it lay there in the golden afternoon light, trusting them in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten. He crouched down, slowly extending a hand. He knew better than to touch it, knew the unspoken rules of distance between man and beast. But the bear didn't flinch. It simply watched him, its deep, dark eyes reflecting something Daniel couldn't quite name. For the first time in his life, he felt truly small. Not in the way humans often did when faced with the vastness of nature, but in a different, humbling way. It was as if the barriers he had always assumed existed, the invisible walls between human and animal, between intelligence and instinct, had just been shattered. He thought back to every documentary he had ever filmed, every lecture he had given, every article he had written about the behavior of predators in the wild. He had spoken about dominance, survival instincts, fear responses. He had classified emotions in animals as something primal, something reactive rather than intentional. But this was something else entirely. He swallowed hard. "What if we've been wrong?" Rick turned to him, brows furrowed. "Wrong about what?" Daniel gestured toward the bear. "About them. About what they're capable of." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "What if they feel more than we've given them credit for? What if they understand more than we think?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Rick scoffed, but there was no real confidence behind it. "Come on, man. You're saying bears have what?" "Empathy." Daniel met his gaze. "A few minutes ago, would you have believed they could communicate like that? That one would step into care for another like that? That a bear would acknowledge us?" Rick said nothing. Jason shifted, rubbing a hand over his face. "Hell, I don't know what to believe anymore." Daniel looked up at the treetops, the last rays of the sun filtering through the dense canopy. He had spent his whole life searching for answers, trying to unravel the mysteries of the wild. But today, standing on that riverbank with the scent of rain-soaked earth in his lungs and the echo of a bear's silent gratitude in his mind, he realized something. Maybe some mysteries weren't meant to be unraveled. Maybe some moments, no matter how inexplicable, were simply meant to be experienced. A chill ran down his spine, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from the sheer, undeniable truth pressing against the edges of his understanding. The wild wasn't just a place of instinct. It was a place of wonder, a place of intelligence, a place of emotions beyond their comprehension. And for the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't sure if he was the observer anymore, or if just maybe he was the one being observed. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the treetops, casting the river in shades of amber and deep blue. The young bear still hadn't moved much, though its breathing had grown steadier. Daniel watched it carefully, his mind a tangle of emotions. He had spent years trying to understand the wild, documenting its dangers, its beauty, its brutality. Yet for the first time, he felt as if he was standing at the edge of something much larger, something beyond logic or science. Then, the moment that changed everything happened. A rustling from the forest signaled the return of the female bear. Daniel tensed, half expecting her to charge, but instead, she approached with the same deliberate calm as before. In her mouth, she carried something, a fish still fresh, its silver scales catching the light. With the gentleness of a mother tending to her young, she placed the fish in front of the injured bear. Then, turning toward Daniel and the other men, she did something that sent a shiver down his spine. She looked at them, truly looked at them, then dipped her head ever so slightly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was something eerily similar to gratitude. Daniel's throat tightened. This couldn't be happening. The logical part of his brain screamed at him, insisting that he was projecting human emotions onto an animal, but deep down, he knew better. Rick whispered, "Is she thanking us?" No one answered. The moment felt too fragile, too sacred to break with words. The young bear weakly sniffed at the fish, and the female stepped back, as if trusting the men to do the rest. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He had always believed humans were the ones watching the wild, studying it, dissecting it. But now, standing there in the fading light, he realized the truth. The wild had been watching them too. The female bear gave one last lingering glance before disappearing into the trees. This time, Daniel didn't feel like he was watching a simple predator retreat into the forest. He felt as though something had been exchanged, something more profound than survival. It wasn't just about instinct. It wasn't just about nature's cold, hard rules. It was about trust. It was about connection. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Daniel knew he would never see the world the same way again. In the days that followed, Daniel couldn't shake what he had witnessed. The nod of acknowledgement, the deliberate offering of food, the silent exchange of trust. Each moment replayed in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew. Back at his research station, he pored over countless studies on bear behavior, searching for any precedent, any documented case of such an interaction. He found none. Bears had been observed showing rudimentary forms of cooperation and even mourning their dead. But gratitude? Conscious recognition of human actions? The scientific community had never formally acknowledged such possibilities. Yet, Daniel had seen it with his own eyes. His hands hovered over his keyboard as he prepared to write his findings. He knew how this would be received. The scientific world thrived on measurable data, controlled environments, and repeatable results. But what he had experienced defied those parameters. It was raw, unquantifiable, a moment beyond science, yet undeniably real. His hesitation lasted only a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he began to type. His article, Beyond Instinct, Rethinking Animal Consciousness, was met with a firestorm of debate. Some scientists dismissed it outright, insisting he had anthropomorphized the bear's actions, seeing what he wanted to see. Others, however, found his account compelling, anecdotal evidence that merited deeper investigation. The article sparked discussions in academic circles, conservation groups, and even government agencies. What if humanity had underestimated the emotional and cognitive depth of the animal kingdom? Soon, researchers across the globe began re-evaluating their approach to wildlife studies. Conservation policies that once treated animals as reactive, instinct-driven beings started incorporating the possibility of emotional intelligence and interspecies recognition. Wildlife laws in several regions shifted, emphasizing coexistence over control, protection over exploitation. For Daniel, the change was even more profound. He had spent his career as an observer, documenting the natural world from behind a lens, always maintaining distance. But that night by the river had changed him. He was no longer satisfied being a passive witness. He wanted to understand, to bridge the invisible gap between human and animal. He left behind traditional research to pioneer new studies on animal cognition, pushing boundaries that had once seemed impossible. His encounters inspired wildlife education programs, urging the public to rethink the way they viewed nature, not as something separate, but as something deeply connected to humanity. And though years passed, one truth remained with him, embedded in his very being. The wild had always been watching, and for the first time, it had let him see. Years had passed since that fateful evening by the river, but Daniel Carter still carried the moment with him, etched into his memory like the grooves of an ancient tree, unshaken by time. The world had moved on, as it always did, but something had changed. Not just within him, but in the way people spoke about the wild. His work had ignited a new wave of research into animal consciousness, drawing scientists, conservationists, and even skeptics into a debate that once seemed unthinkable. Could animals possess a level of understanding that went beyond instinct? Could they experience gratitude, empathy, even forge connections beyond their own species? Governments and conservation groups had begun to take notice. Policies once centered around managing wildlife populations were evolving toward coexistence, emphasizing respect over control. Protected habitats expanded, and human-wildlife interaction protocols changed, prioritizing mutual recognition rather than fear-based deterrence. People who had once viewed predators as mindless beasts began to see them differently, not as threats to be managed, but as sentient beings sharing the planet. And Daniel? He was no longer the same man who had stood on that riverbank, awestruck and disbelieving. The experience had rewritten the very foundation of his understanding, not just of animals, but of life itself. He had spent decades documenting the wild, believing himself an outsider peering in. But now, he knew the truth. There was no division, no great chasm between human and animal. There was only connection. He had stood at the edge of understanding, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the wild had reached back. As he looked out over another river, another stretch of untamed land, he couldn't help but wonder, how many moments like this had gone unnoticed? How many silent gestures, how many unspoken acknowledgments had been dismissed as mere coincidence? Perhaps the wild had been speaking all along. Perhaps humanity was only now learning how to listen.